Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Or shall I say, patients. So, welcome back. I hope my time away hasn't caused too much chaos. It was admittedly quite difficult to restore balance back here at the asylum. I mean, I had to do it once before. Clearly, I had to do it again. My patients need more medication, because I need more screams. So, tonight I have found a new author for us to enjoy. I hope he is good enough to remain a part of our family. Now, you may be been brought here against your will, or you may have voluntarily committed yourself. But while you are here, allow me to entertain you. You certainly can't leave, at least for now. While you are here, allow me to introduce myself. I am Beyond 5150, and I am in charge of this asylum. I will be your sovereign of the spine-tingling, your master of the macabre, your purveyor of the petrifying. I am your god of all things horrifying. I'll tell you stories you will wish you had never heard. Try as you might, you won't find your happy place here. So welcome your current circumstances and just accept the hair rising on your neck, your chills and goosebumps. No, and there is no milk and cookies. Now sit back, relax, and wait for the doctor to call you back. The first story I'm going to be reading is from a new author, as I had mentioned earlier. This author named is Objective Tell 6047. There's quite a few interesting stories, and I hope you do enjoy them. This first story is titled, My Roommate Keeps Screaming Every Night. It all began when I moved out of state for school. The college of my choice had an incredibly good architectural program, and I wanted to get into it. There were two slight problems before moving. First was the getting a job. It didn't prove difficult getting one in this college town, but the second problem, that seemed more challenging, and it was finding an apartment that I could afford. In this town, even a small room off campus wasn't cheap. By some miracle, I found one listing after seemingly endless hours of checking openings. The ad in question was for a small 2-story house in an adjacent town that was perfectly in my price range. Considering how short of time I had before moving in time for semester, and there was nothing else as cheap, I immediately took the room. I moved into the house with a few possessions that I took with me. The owner was a young woman about my age named Michelle. She was a slim-figured person with a shade of yellow hair that almost looked white. Her eyes, they were the bluest of blues I had ever seen in person. And she was really big help to me when I was moving my things into the house and unpacking. The house was a small 2-story Italianate-style home sitting on a luscious green lawn. Michelle told me the house had belonged to her grandparents and needed some refurbishing. I thought the house looked beautiful. The style, the setting, combined with the right amount of aging, gave the house a picturesque look. It could have easily come straight out of a painting. It was so beautiful. The first detail I noticed of Michelle was her sense of fashion. She dressed in a dark reddish-brown sweater and a brown scarf to blend with the color of autumn around her and the property. She completed the look with blue skinny jeans and black boots. The other day I noticed upon closer inspection was the slight but recognizable bags under her eyes, which suggested to me she had been suffering from sleep deprivation. I hadn't noticed this given how much energy she gave out. She must have been caffeinated to the gills to help me out that day. I didn't want to say anything to her about it, though. I only had one chance to make a good first impression with my roommate. Excuse me. We got done moving, and she showed me around the house. My room was on the main floor. It was bare, green-walled. Sorry, I lost my spot. I apologize. My room was on the main floor. It was a bare, green-walled, empty room, aside from a bed, a complete headboard, antique dresser with a mirror attached to it, and an open walk-in closet. My mind was already planning on how to decorate the room. Then she led me upstairs and informed me that her room was on the second floor. Below the stairs, I noticed a large framed picture of an old man with a blank, expressionless look on his face. He both seemed to be staring at the camera, taking his picture, and also staring at me with some unnatural fashion. I asked Michelle who the old man was in the photo. She stared at the photo and also with a wide-eyed, fearful look on her face. She flatly said it was her grandfather, and then we quickly turned up the stairs as if to get away from his unending gaze. Now, as far as the rules go, she didn't have a lot of them. At least none that were extreme, but she told me one. Actually, it wasn't so much a rule as it was a little warning. That made me scratch my head in confusion. I don't really remember doing it, she explained. But people have told me I tend to make noises late at night, and I tend to go on for a while. I lowered the rent because I feel like it's the least I could do if it bothers you. All I can ask is, if you hear anything from my room, don't worry about it. I'll be fine. But if it gets to be too much, I'll understand. I'll even reimburse you. It was a strange rule, to be sure. Noises? What kind of noises? Then I remembered the benefits I had living here and thought to myself, maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe she just was a loud moaner during some late-night sessions, and she didn't want to put it into words for me. I didn't press the issue. I thought to myself, I'd just let her have her privacy. I was thoroughly exhausted after a long day of moving things into my new room, but Michelle was a big help. She purchased takeout that night, what she called her move-in special, which consisted of a pizza, some Chinese food, and an order of taquitos. Normally, I'd prefer something more nutritionally complete, but I wasn't in the mood to debate. My body was ready to devour every carb in sight. I inhaled a little bit of everything, sometimes mixing them to make some unholy abomination of takeout. The taste, it was funky and greasy, but I downed it all, and then I felt like I could finish up a pint of ice cream. And with the help of my new roommate, I did. Exhaustion finally hit me like a brick wall. I finally turned in for the night, resolving to decorate my room in the morning. I was awakened in the night by a sudden rumbling in my insides, and I darted to the bathroom. The mixture of Italian, Chinese, and takeout had not been sitting well and turned my colon into a war zone. After I exited the bathroom, I heard a sound that reverberated throughout the otherwise quiet house. It took me a moment to realize it was screaming, a high-pitched, shrill screaming full of danger and fear that came from the second floor. I realized it was coming from Michelle's room. Forgetting what she told me earlier, I ran upstairs to her room and knocked on the door. Her screaming was all that I could hear. I tried turning the knob and only found that it was locked. She kept screaming, and I could hear thrashing and thumping as if she was being thrown around the room. I called 911, and a police cruiser reached my house within minutes of my call. There was only one officer who came, and I was struck by how similar he looked to Michelle. Slender body type, bright blonde hair, and blue eyes. He went by Officer Tears, and he was, in fact, Michelle's older brother. He'd been on duty that night and happened to be in the area when my emergency call went out. I had gone upstairs with him, and by that time, the screaming had stopped. He knocked on the door, and Michelle opened the door in just a few seconds. "Hey, sis." He greeted her with a smile on her drowsy face. Your roommate said you were screaming, and I thought I'd check on you." "I'm okay, Ben. Thanks for checking." She ended by closing the door. Ben, or Officer Tears, walked back out after filling out a report and was about to enter his vehicle when I stopped him. "What was that?" I asked him. The incident of her screaming and now being okay suddenly, it was unnerving. "Michelle suffers from night terrors," he said, turning back to me. "She's had for a long time. It's okay, though. They only sound worse than they really are. If it happens again, just call 911 and I'll be over quickly." He drove off in his cruiser. I walked back inside and felt weird about that night. I wondered to myself if this was the noise Michelle was talking about. I saw her again in the following morning. She looked more upbeat than I was expecting her to be. She was once again dressed in a fashionable sweater and jeans for her day. I asked her about the previous night, and she looked dumbfounded. I reminded her about screaming, and then her cheerful smile gravitated downward. "I'm sorry," she said in a sad tone. I don't really remember what happens, but everyone tells me I have night terrors. I guess I've had them since I was a kid. I'm sorry about last night, but it's really nothing to worry about. They don't last long, and I wake up fine. If you want to leave, though, I understand." I felt sorry for her in that moment. I told her it's okay as long as she's not hurting herself. Besides, where else could I go? I stayed there for 2 weeks. every night she had her screaming episodes, and they would always occur between midnight and 3 a.m., going off and on with intervals. Just when I think she'd finally stopped and could go back to sleep, she'd start up again. I could hear her screaming during the night since her bedroom was right above mine. Sometimes I'd hear her walk around the room and thrash against a wall or furniture as if she was sleepwalking. I wouldn't be able to sleep during this entire time because the noise, it was so gut-wrenching. I could never ignore it. During the mornings, she'd look so positive and chipper on her way to her classes, and I feel like I didn't sleep a wink at all. She'd be out with her cheeriness, and I started feeling resentment for her. I started looking for changes in my schedule to find some relief. I tried looking for night classes, night shifts. I had to look for anything so I wouldn't be at home during the night and hear her scream. I found a position as an overnight stalker at a major retail company. I also managed to get classes for the morning. I never saw Michelle much, but I was glad not to hear her night terrors anymore. It was on the rare instance when I did see her, I would notice something else. I went to the bathroom one night and saw Michelle standing in front of a mirror. This was the first time I'd seen her without a sweater or jeans. At that time, she was wearing a pink top and matching shorts. The skin of her exposed upper back, it had signs of scarring and bruising. Her arms were covered in bruises. I think I even saw traces of bite marks on her. The second time I was home, I was checking her room upstairs. The room, which was open at the time, wasn't out of the ordinary. Some posters, makeup table, and a bed filled the room. Then, the room, it suddenly felt cold and sinister, as if some unseen figure was inside and dared me to enter. I never walked out of an empty room so fast in all my life. It was my day off from classes and no work that night when I was home. I would finally understand the story behind Michelle's night terrors. I came home running after running some errands, and I was ready to drop when I noticed a bright silver sedan in the driveway. I didn't recognize it. I walked inside to see Michelle, her brother Ben, and then two others I didn't recognize, carrying some rolls of some sort of insulation material. Michelle introduced the older people as her parents, and they were over to help soundproof her bedroom. Her parents greeted me instantly with cheerful smiles and somewhat tired looks on their faces. I felt bad that I didn't help them set up the material, but I had no more energy for even the smallest chore, and I wasn't comfortable going back in that room anymore. After my quick nap, I found everyone still downstairs. Michelle was going out for takeout and wanted to know what I wanted. She left, and I got to know her parents more. I asked why they were soundproofing the room. They told me Michelle had noticed I had changed my schedule so I would avoid her sleeping patterns and get some rest. She had felt so guilty because she really thought of me as a friend and wanted to make some accommodations for me. Then, they told me about the origin of her nightly episodes. It was one day when Michelle was 4 years old. The family was visiting her grandfather, whose mental health had been declining after the death of his wife. Whenever they talked to him, he would say little, if anything, and then have a blank stare on his face. They had noticed, however, that whenever he looked at little Michelle, his expression would change in a way that they could only describe as odd. They spent the night at the house, thinking nothing of his behavior that evening. Later in the night, parents heard a blood-curdling scream coming from Michelle's room. They darted into the room and found an obscured figure looming over her and wielding a large kitchen knife in his hand. The father grabbed a lamp in the room and smashed it over the assailant's head. They switched on the overhead lights and found the intruder was the grandfather, who still held the knife in his hands. The impact of the blow killed him instantly. And though she was physically uninjured, Michelle's young mind just could not process the event that had happened. What resulted was years and years of night terrors in which Michelle would scream her lungs out. It also wasn't unusual for her to throw herself around the room and sustain some kind of injuries. I felt worse than ever after hearing about her tragic origin story. I complained about how her screams were keeping me up all night. But she was the one who had gone through a traumatizing incident. I think I would have been more surprised if she wasn't having night terrors. I thought about what he may have been planning to do, and the thought of it made me shudder. Since I was off that night, it was one of the rare nights that I was home and was able to fall asleep instantly. The soundproofing must have done the trick, because I don't recall hearing Michelle scream at all. I think I would have preferred that to what came next. I had a vivid nightmare that night that I still recall with clear detail. I was in Michelle's room, and I had been screaming in the silent darkness of my room. I was afraid no one would hear me and not come to help. It didn't matter how loud I projected my wails. Above me was a dark silhouette of a person whose face gradually came into detail. It was the face of an older man, wide-eyed and a large grin splitting his face. He was what I was screaming at. I saw him throw me out the window, and my body broke through the glass pane, and shards surrounded me as I fell outside and fell to the pavement. I woke up to the sound of shattered glass outside and a large thud just outside my window. I rushed to the window and saw the bruised and still body of Michelle in the driveway. She was motionless, and a pool of blood began to form around her head. I was horrified by what looked like a suicide, but then I heard laughing above me. I turned my head upwards to Michelle's shattered bedroom window, and my heart stopped. The same grinning, insane man from my nightmare was leaning over the shattered window with glee on his face. I was sure he was looking at me before, and then he disappeared. It seemed so familiar. I called 911 just like before, and once again, Ben pulled up to the house in his police cruiser. He stood frozen while looking at the lifeless cadaver that had once been his younger sister. An ambulance appeared behind him and took his sister away. They didn't switch on the siren and lights. No point to it, as it was too late. This time, Ben wasn't alone on patrol tonight, and they both grilled me about what had happened. I think they were trying to pin me to her death, as if I had killed her. I wanted to tell the truth, but what was I going to tell them? That some psychotic old man who threw her out the window and literally vanished before my eyes? If I said that, forget jail. I'd go to the psychiatric unit. I told them I didn't know what happened. I just woke up and found her dead outside my window. I think Ben really vouched for me and ruled his sister's death was accidental suicide. I was turning back around and past the stairs when my body suddenly froze. My body was reacting to a very sudden, dreadful realization. I was once again looking at the picture of Michelle's grandfather, his flat expression ever staring into me. My heart suddenly dropped and my blood seemed to freeze in my veins. It was him in my dream. It was him grinning from the window before he evaporated like steam. I backed up the next day, quit my job, dropped out of school, and went back home. I wanted to go anywhere I could just to get away from the house. I never went back there. I want to say things got better for me after that, but that's not how my story ends. Whatever that thing was that had followed me back to my house. Sometimes I'd be asleep or awake, and I'd see that insane, grinning man hovering over me, and I'd be the one screaming. And that was the end of that. I thought that was quite a good story. Definitely has all the things needed to send that chill up your spine. How would you feel if you had this happen where your roommate is thrown out of a window and the demon that did it follows you home when you leave? Okay, so looks like I'm looking over at everyone who is listening, and I want to say hello to everyone. We have Victor, and I know he just recently left, but glad he was here to at least say hello. And then we have Mine Man Day. I'm not sure who that is, but hello, welcome. Josie, how you doing? And we got Noose as the Noose Titans, Fresh Ethan, Mia, Dustin, and looks like Josie's mom, Bad Choice, Christine, good to see you. Mighty Might, good to see you as well. Welcome. And I think that must be it. At least, did I see anyone? Yeah, I mentioned you, Ethan. Welcome. Good to see you all. Now, I did want to let you all know, I'll be changing my schedule going forward here. Instead of Wednesdays and Sundays, we will now be doing the streams on Wednesdays and Saturdays. The time will remain the same. It'll 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. I figured this would allow more people to join us for the weekend streams. I'm also looking into possibly adding a third stream. This would be not stories that do not fall into the creepy pasta genre. More child-friendly, as I know there are a few people who have children that would like to be able to listen to stories, but not end up with nightmares. So that will probably be coming in the future here shortly. No worries, Mia. Go ahead and get your dinner. So, we'll go ahead and get started on the next story. Hope you all enjoyed that one. This was also, the author again is Objective Tell 6047. Kind of hope it would have been able to hop in to listen, but I guess they might be busy, unfortunately. But either way, no worries. So, since it is now the Christmas season, wondering how everyone is feeling this year, especially since, all the difficulties we've had across the world with the health issues and just being stuck at home. So what are you all hoping for in the next year? What do you want for either a Christmas wish or a New Year's resolution type thing? Let me know. One moment. I'm going to go ahead and take care of some patients. Okay. Sorry about that. One of my patients clearly needed another dose of medication. Can't let him act like that anymore. Bad attitude. Well, it could have benefits. We'll have to just punish him later. So, we're going to go ahead and start on the next story. Again, this would be the same author. There are no other links available to reach this author other than through Reddit. Just so everybody knows, I do make sure to leave all my authors' names in the description, along with any links they have in either Reddit or if they have specific personal links to Patreon or their own YouTube or wherever. So if you have a story that you would like read, feel free to message me. You know what? I should probably add the email address for you guys to use to contact to send these stories. But I will have no problem reading any stories you all might send, as long as they fit within the theme of creepypasta. If they aren't creepypastas, I'll set them aside for that third stream. I might do it once a month, the non-horror style stories. But you are more than welcome to send any stories to my email, which is the number 2, farbeyond5150 @gmail. farbeyond5150 @gmail. So, if you do wish to send some stories to me, that is the place you're going to go to send it to. Okay, so the next story is I narrated a murder confession. Sounds fun. I guess to begin with, I had a career of narrating creepypastas on the YouTube. Originally, it started out as a hobby, but I eventually got to a point where I could do it full time and make a decent living out of it. I'd been interested in creepypastas for a few years and listened to a lot of narrators. My favorite was always Demon Creep. Whenever he read stories or did LPs on his channel, I written my own stories and sent them to him, and it gave me the idea of, I want to do this. So I practiced my storytelling abilities, and with some tech classes, I began my own YouTube channel. I would narrate other people's stories I found on Reddit, and on occasion narrated my own stories. I'd even post non-creepypastas related to material like music and videos. I did some experimentation with ASMR, but found that to be unlike me. My narration voice had a let's read or King Spook kind of quality. Deep, velvety tone with a hint of something sinister behind it, like a madman's lullaby. Sorry. I guess I got some of Liam Vickers' sense of poetics in there as well. Now, if you're wondering about my channel and want to check it out, don't bother. I deleted it. as well as all my social media and fundraising accounts, and changed my email. I made sure no trace of my work existed anywhere on the internet anymore. After what I had just gone through, I felt it best to delete everything. To me, one story could make or break my career. You can probably guess which one happened. One story I received, one that practically got me arrested, turned out not to be a story at all. It was a murder confession. Now, sometimes I would go to creepypasta.com and select stories there, but I also had a subreddit in which people could submit their stories to me. This story came through there. It was submitted by a user I didn't recognize. I can't give any details about it because, as far as I know, everything's still under investigation. The story went as follows. I was driving down a dark road in almost blinding rain. The back road was slick and wet that I nearly drove myself into a ditch. It would have been very easy to drive off the road and get into an accident if I didn't have my headlights and high beams on. I was listening to local radio broadcasts being informed of some missing people from the Tri-City area. All were young women with seemingly no connection to each other. After a while, the rain finally stopped, and I could see everything a little more clearly. The clouds overhead had parted, and the moon had revealed her rays on this back road. Up ahead, I could make out the shape and lights of a parked car on the side of the road, blinkers signaling hopefully to any other traveler out at night. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a person leaning against the video wearing a bright yellow coat. I got closer and found it was a young woman standing outside her car. She was pretty enough to be sure, and she was naturally tan skin with matching hazel brown hair. Her bright raincoat was the only source of brightness around here. The most striking feature about this woman that I had noticed before anything else was her eyes. They were the shade of green, like a pair of emeralds. They were seemingly otherworldly shade of green. "You okay?" I asked the girl. "My car started acting up and died. My phone isn't working either. Could I get a lift?" she asked, with her face full of gloom. I told her I'd be happy to help her out. Those kind words brought a smile to her sad face instantly. "Oh, thank you so much," she squealed as she practically jumped into the passenger seat. I drove off, leaving her lonely car behind in the darkness. She turned out to be going the same direction I was going, so giving her a lift wasn't too big of a deal. We rode in relative silence for a while, aside from the radio station still reporting on the missing people. She was quiet amid the reporting, maybe knowing someone who went missing, or feeling uncomfortable with the subject matter. I found myself making quick glances at her. Besides the wetness of her clothing and her hair, she was pretty. Where are you heading?" I asked curiously. "I'm just heading home," she responded, not taking her eyes off the road. "I spent more time with my friends tonight than I should have, so I have to go back. I got hit with the rain, and then my car started acting up on me." You mean just friends or boyfriend?" I asked bashfully. She turned and gave a friendly smile to me. "Just friends," she informed me. I smiled back at her. "Where are you heading from?" she asked me. "I'm just coming back from a shift," I told her. "I'm a carpet cleaner." She nodded back to me. It was a few minutes before we said anything else. "Thanks again for helping me. I didn't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." I glanced at her again, this time hypnotized by her eyes. "You know, you should be really careful when hitchhiking or flagging down a ride," You don't know what kind of psycho is out there. The person behind the kidnappings could have gotten you instead of someone else. Her smile faded and she nodded. Interesting fact. Did you know Edmund Kemper, the co-ed serial killer, picked up hitchhikers and killed them at a remote spot? Oh, really? A look of nervousness had begun to carve on her face. I'm sorry, I said with a slight chuckle. I have an interest in abnormal psychology and serial killers, and I tend to blurt out facts at random. No, it's okay. It's kind of fascinating, she said with a slight laugh. I could tell she was trying to hide her discomfort by wearing a fragile mask of politeness. Given her predicament, she had no choice but to take a ride with some random person. We didn't say anything else for a while as I drove onward. I later assured her I knew a shortcut as I turned on another street in the backwoods area. I knew this spot very well. It was a quiet area, especially this time of night. I slowed the car to a stop, telling my passenger I made a wrong turn. I made her believe I was reaching for my phone to pull out a map. Instead, I pulled out my switchblade and shoved the knife into her exposed neck. She never had time to respond. After pulling the knife out of her flesh, the blood flowed out of her neck like red ribbons on her skin. She began suffocating while looking at me in terror. She had exited the vehicle while losing more and more blood. I laughed, knowing full well she'd be dead well before any help came along. All she had to go on was just the slightest bit of hope for survival. It was a sight I took delight on, just seeing how far they'd go before they collapse from blood loss and the body gives out. She'd gone about 5 feet from the road and into the clearing before her knees buckled and she collapsed under her own weight. She writhed on the ground after making contact with the cold, damp earth. I admit she had gone farther than I expected her to. The last one never made it 2 feet away from me before the same thing happened. I lit up a Marlboro and waited for her to finish dying. She gave some small twitches as I observed her at a distance. When I stopped hearing noises coming from her, I walked over to her still, dead form. A quick nudge from my boot informed me she was, in fact, lifeless, aside from her eyes remaining open. I made quick work of plucking out her green eyes, placed them in a jar I keep in the trunk. I drove off, leaving my victim behind in the darkness. Someone might find her later, but I don't want to be here when they do. This story made for a short video, and it became a success overnight. I had countless views and comments, all saying how real the story felt, and others making crude jokes about the murderer. I admit, I even thought it was real for a second. It was as if I was observing the events through the killer's eyes. I didn't realize how real it turned out to be. It was a day or two later, late morning, when I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to be greeted by 2 police officers and a squad car in my driveway. They got my identification, and I was escorted by them to the car. They didn't mention that I was under arrest, but rather that they had questions for me. I felt obligated to go along and cooperate. I waited in an interrogation room, complete with a simple desk, 1 chair, and what I assumed to be a two-way mirror. Someone might have been on the other side deciding what to do with me. All that went through my mind was what happened that got me in here. After a long time, 2 people entered. The man was a burly white male in a white collared shirt and rolled up sleeves. I don't know what health issues he had, but sweat seemed to have glistened on his exposed arms and face. The other person was an African-American woman in a purple coat and skirt. I was thinking one of them may have been a detective and the other an actual cop. They had come inside and their stoic faces stared right into me. "We understand you have a YouTube channel, right?" the woman asked. I had answered in the affirmative. They inquired about my latest video, about a murder. I told them about it and asked what was going on, that I was there. They answered me, and the explanation still gives me a feeling of nausea and freezes my blood. About 7:30 a.m. in the previous mornings, 2 civilians were driving down Old Country Road, an unpaved dirt road just outside of town. They stopped on the road due to a flat tire. While changing to a new one, the passenger noticed a strange white shape in the clearing off the road in the grass. They got close enough to see the shape better and screamed loud enough to break the morning silence. The sight was the body of a young girl, mutilated and dead. She laid still, pale and damp from a mix of morning dew and dried blood. There was an obvious knife wound in her neck, aimed right at the jugular vein so she would bleed out the quickest. That wasn't the only detail about this gruesome discovery. There were 2 bloodied holes where her eyes should have been, 2 red, dark caverns in the frozen face that became home to insects. An ambulance and police made it to the scene and began the investigation. The victim in question still had her ID and wallet with her. The killer obviously didn't want anything of monetary value from her, but I know what they did want. The one detail on her card struck me was her eye color. Green. The police had other leads in the Tri-City area. There were other reports of women either going missing or being found as Bloody's corpse. All with missing eyes. The killing spree had been going on for about a year now. The only 2 things that linked these victims together was that they were all given a ride by someone else due to car problems, and their eyes were some shade of green. This person, who they called the Green-Eyed Killer, was still at large as far as they knew. The details of the scene weren't yet known to the public at the time my video came out. The police were digging for details and clues, and somehow one of them caught my video and linked me to the murder. I told them the details about how I got the story submitted to me a couple nights ago on Reddit. They were skeptical about it, my explanation, but decided to keep me in a cell until they decided what to do with me. They did a search of my house and checked my laptops. After a few hours of finding the story I told them and finding nothing else to link me to the crime, they finally let me go, but they kept my computer for a while. I didn't follow the details of the investigation after being let go. I eventually got my laptop back, and when I did, the first thing I did was tell my fan base about what happened and that I made the toughest choice of my life. I thanked everyone for all the love and support, and then I deleted everything. My Reddit page, my channel, my social media accounts, my fundraising accounts, all deleted. I got rid of everything because I didn't want to go through another incident like that. Worse, I hated the idea of profiting off a murder just for views. I'll end with a warning. If you're a young woman with green eyes and your cars break down during the night, be careful who you get a ride from. They may be the last voice you see, the last face you see. That was the end of that story. Excuse me. You know, I actually forgot to switch back the page window. All right. I hope you all enjoyed that story. Definitely has that perfect creep factor. Now, if only they had been brought to the asylum, I could have made use of that author. Well, maybe he'll join us in the future. So, the third story is again from the same author, Objective Tell 6047. Now, if you are enjoying the author's stories, please go check them out on the Reddit. I placed the link in the description below. Make sure you give them a good thumbs up. Let them know you enjoyed the story. Provide them with some support in that manner, because they obviously deserve it. I mean, once they get here, I'm definitely going to be putting them to work. I must have my masterpiece one day. Okay, so the third story is titled, There's a Corpse in My Bed. Have a drink before I start. Alrighty. I used to be a total horror junkie. My main favorites were all the slasher movies from the 80s. I had posters of all the big characters. Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, etc. If you name the character, I probably had some representation of them as a poster or a figurine. I even got into the newer names of horror, like Five Nights at Freddy's. Those games, even if they are old now. Then, I had an experience as a teenager that it made me rethink what horror is to me. Nowadays, I find nothing scarier than real life or what people can do to each other. During my junior year of high school, my parents moved us to a small town in northern Ohio. My parents, who worked for the same company, had gotten a transfer, leading to a raise and a slightly better house. We moved into a 2-story white house that sat on a back road. The nearest neighbors were about a mile away. I considered it to be the literal middle of nowhere. My parents had gotten a good deal on the house, and there was nothing wrong with the house itself. The plumbing was working, there was no stains anywhere. The house was in rather good shape. The only thing was that the last owner had left a few of their possessions behind. A few clothes. Appliances were still there when we arrived. The real estate agent said the last owner had left in a hurry. A few house payments were missed before anyone knew what had happened. It seemed weird to my parents, but not a deal breaker. We moved in immediately. Everything that the last owner left behind was stored and sold off. I started to like the house and property after a while. I had my first backyard, and it was big. At the end of our property was our neighbor's farming fields, but their house was still way out there. I started doing okay at the new school and made some new friends after the first couple days. My parents had a client party one night, so I was left alone with our dog Benji. We were watching my top slasher film, Nightmare on Elm Street, the original one. I thought Robert Englund had done an amazing job of it. I was near the middle of the movie when I heard the call of nature. I paused the movie so I wouldn't miss anything of which I'd already seen 100 times. Benji was sleeping on the sofa when I'd left. The bathroom was upstairs, and just outside of it was a window that was overlooking the backyard. I finished my business and walked out to hear Benji downstairs barking loudly at something. It sounded like he was in the kitchen below me. I was going back downstairs when I checked out the window. Then I saw something strange. The back light wasn't on, so I admit I couldn't see anything under the dim moonlight. But I swear I could make out the shape of a person in my backyard. Their back to me. I walked back downstairs and through the kitchen where I could reach the door to the backyard. Benji was at the door, still barking. I switched the backlight on and saw nothing out there. I stepped further to get a better view, but there was still nothing there. I stood where I was for about a minute to be sure. I guess it was my imagination, I decided. Plus, Benji does tend to bark at nothing. We went back to watching the movie while I was feeling slightly unnerved. As the movie ended, I deduced I'd spooked myself. Constant movie consumption, late night pasta readings. It just finally got to me. I was feeling tired and went up to my room, which is also upstairs. Benji went with me. I needed him with me because something just was not right. I felt like someone was in the house with me, even though I'm supposed to be alone. We reached the top of the stairs, and I noticed the air around me felt cold, like cold as ice. This was September going into October in Ohio. It doesn't get this cold for no reason. I could see my breath as I walked upstairs. I walked to my closed bedroom door and felt the temperature in the well-insulated house drop further. I turned the doorknob. The cold metal burned my skin as I gripped it. I turned the cold metal and opened the door, the wood creaking loudly throughout the house. My darkened room was heavy, with the air of dread and the bile rising in my throat, coating it with a thick, sour taste. Though the room was dark, I could still make out the shape of my bed and my desk and other possessions. I wondered what was causing my anxiety until I looked closer at my bed. The covers were pulled over neatly, and under them I could make out a human-looking shape underneath the covers. I rubbed my eyes, believing this must be a delusion, or even an illusion. Then I looked back and realized this was no trick of my eyes. There was a shape of a body beneath my covers. I couldn't tell because it was so dark, but I could have sworn I saw the slight rising and falling of breathing coming from there. The shape started rising slowly until sitting completely upright. The blanket slipped off, revealing the scarred, dead face of a pale girl. She had small cuts and bruises covering her face. She wore a dirty t-shirt, her arms looking skinned as the flesh was exposed. She went from sitting upright to standing on my mattress. Benji was not growling at the ghostly intruder, but instead whimpered as he backed away. Her clothes had been covered in dirt and dried blood and torn all over. After standing straight up and towering over me, she raised her arm slowly and pointed toward the window. She opened her mouth to an impossibly wide gape and let out a blood-curdling scream that caused reverberations throughout the house. This was the kind of scream filled with suffering and torment as her dead eyes buried into me. I ran out of the house and downstairs to get away from the sight of the dead girl and that horrid scream that filled the whole house. Benji ran with me as we bolted out of the house. We made it out to the road when my parents finally come home. Sensing my distress, I told them what I seen, and they went upstairs to investigate. Of course, there was nothing there. They told me I probably just had a nightmare, even though I wasn't even asleep then. They advised I should cut back on the late-night movies. I didn't sleep in my room that night. I chose the sofa downstairs. I started thinking, Maybe I'd psyched myself into a really vivid nightmare. So I started to forget about the dead girl. That is, until a few days later. My dad was starting to make a garden in our backyard during the afternoon. I'd been helping him that day. While digging, we heard Benji barking in the center of the yard. He been digging over there himself, and he must have found something. Dad and I went over to see what was wrong, and he'd retched when he saw the decomposing remains of a human hand. He called 911, and a team was sent over to dig up the yard. It wasn't just a hand that was buried, but a whole person. Even more disturbing than this gruesome discovery was it was the girl I had seen in my room a few nights ago. Heavily decomposing, maggots all over her body and feasting on her remains. It took a while before we learned anything about who she was and what happened to her. When we did, I felt the wind had been knocked out of me. The girl had been identified as Catherine Winters, a local high school student who had been missing for almost a whole year. She'd been last seen leaving school after club activities and walked home. She hadn't been seen since. Months had gone by without any leads, and the police had all but exhausted their resources. As for the state she had been found in, the mortician found several disturbing details surrounding the young girl. Beaten, bloody. There had been red marks and indentations around her wrists, indicating she had been bound in handcuffs or shackles. The same marks could be found on her ankles, and there were deep bruises on her legs where it was determined someone had shattered her leg bones. Someone didn't want her to run away while they continued to torture her. Judging from her body shape, she must have been held captive for months, receiving food and water rarely, if at all. She'd been starved and dehydrated for a long time. When she hadn't been neglected, she'd been tortured. There were burn marks around her body where perhaps a lighter or a lit cigar or cigarette contacted her skin. She also had cuts and bruises all around her body. In some areas, she had patches of skin missing from her body. One of her eyes had suffered damage. The thought of her torture was downright chilling and nauseating. There was, however, one more detail that whenever I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. There was dried DNA samples found between her thighs, suggesting she'd also been sexually assaulted by her captor. Most likely, this had gone on for some time. Even more disturbing was that there were traces of relatively fresh samples found, which points to her being sexually assaulted post-mortem. Captor may have kept her body from decomposing faster so he could continue to violate her lifeless body. The last act of dominance of a sick man over a dead girl. The killer and the captor had buried Catherine in the backyard before leaving, possibly being seen by someone, or had gone to a new town in search for new victims. Catherine had been cremated after the autopsy, and her remains were returned to her family. It seemed, at last, they'd found some closure, but no justice. Meanwhile, the previous owner was being tracked down by the authorities. I'd never told anyone else about seeing her a few nights before. That had been my secret, until now. I never slept very well in that house after moving out, and even then, I think about it on most nights. I replay my ghostly encounter in my mind and think about her pointing to the window to the backyard and the pain-filled, banshee-like scream. Started thinking about what had happened, And why? Was Catherine Winters trying to tell me where her body was? Was she trying to tell me what she'd gone through? Was she trying to get closure for a grieving family? Real life can be more horrifying than any work of fiction. And that is the end of that story. Definitely a really well written story. I gotta say, I might have to bring this author to the asylum. Maybe I'll send one of my people to go get her. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed it. We're going to go ahead and read a new story, another story. This one is from Dustin, PA Nightmares. So, this is titled Stick and Stones. Now, Dustin, if you have any other places you would like to be credited, webpage, Reddit page, YouTube, whatever, let me know. I'll make sure to get it put in. Go ahead and put it in the chat or something. Otherwise, it was written by PA Nightmares, who is a good friend of mine and very good author. So I hope you all enjoy this story. A man awakens in a dark room, zip-tied to a chair. Yet he does not remember how he got there. He assumes that the throbbing of his head may have something to do with the reason. As he sits there in the darkened room, his mind slowly begins to recall the events that led him to this unfamiliar place. James walked into his boss's office, superstar Travis Murphy. This man ruled the law firm. No case was too big or too small for him to take on. It simply didn't matter. He had never lost, and he would do anything to keep that streak alive. What took you so long? I could have aged 10 years if you moved any slower. Pick up the pace. Could find your replacement by the day's end if not, Travis remarked. James looked down at the floor, his demeanor stiff and cowardly. Sorry, Mr. Murphy. It will not happen again. I'll make sure to move quicker, James whispered. You're pathetic, you know that? You worked as my personal secretary for years, yet you show no frickin' backbone. Do you have no ambition to move in the company? Travis harshly laughed. Sorry, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll keep that in mind, sir. May I be excused, sir? James fearfully spoke. His boss was clearly in a bad mood. It was always best to keep your head down and fly under his radar when he was irrational like this. Getting to work on his daily tasks, he kept the thoughts of what his boss had said in the back of his mind. He is not that pathetic. He has a wife, children, and is very happy. So what if he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth? This is what he has to do in order to put food on the table and keep his family clothed. Does this fucking bastard not realize words hurt? Seriously, sticks and stones may very well break bones like we're taught as children. However, words can very well hurt you too. Pen is mightier than swords. This has been James' favorite quote. The reason for this is that the words have started wars as well as ended wars. They have saved lives and ended lives. Now to hear this fucking throwing insults around and then telling me how to live my life? Someone needs to put this fucking asshole in his place, James thought to himself. The phone begins to ring as he's lost in deep within thought. He mindlessly answers the phone for the 100th time that day, and immediately hears the familiar voice of his sister. "Katie, how are you? This is a nice surprise," he says. He quickly realizes she is crying, which snaps him out of his thoughts. James' tone of voice is full of concern when he speaks out again. "What's wrong, sis?" On the other end of the phone, Katie sobs, her words caught within her throat as she struggles to catch her breath. "Lexi is dead," she manages to say. Those 3 words shattered James's world. He loved his niece dearly, and she was only 15 years old. How did it happen? "She was hit by a car on her way home from school. The driver fled. He crashed his car not far from where he had hit her. The cops realized he was drunk when they got to him." His sister spoke once more. This time she had a little more composure. The line quickly disconnects. James looks up to see his boss towering over him. "What do you think you're doing? You know personal calls are not to be made during work hours. Are you stupid, or you want me to fire you today?" "I didn't make the call, sir. But I did just get news my niece has been killed in a hit and run today. I need to go home and be with my family, Mr. Murphy. Is that okay with you, sir?" James speaks. Tears welled in his eyes as he tried to keep his composure. His boss's eyes clouded with anger. "Is that okay with me?" "No, it's not okay with me, you moron! Do you know why I came out to see your own pathetic ass was doing? Because I just had to answer my own phone like some common lawyer. We have a new case. Government's official son has been in a car accident. He hit some stupid child and is facing some serious charges. He'll need to work overtime today." James stands up, his face mere inches from his boss's. He has to try and do something for once. "You do realize you're defending the person that just killed my niece, don't you? You cannot take this case. Give it to someone else. Please, sir," James begs him. "I've worked for you for years. Do me this one favor. Don't take this case." Travis looks him up and down, his expression changing from anger to one of pure amusement. "You really think you matter to me at all? This high-profile case, and with it comes money and prestige. Also, you're fired. So clean out your desk. Get your pathetic, cowardly presence out of my face and out of my office. If you're still here in 30 minutes, I'll have security throw you out on your ass." James, feeling defeated, cleans out his desk and leaves. He did not have much to clean out, therefore it took him a total of 10 minutes. He realized that he still had his access card upon leaving the building. "Fuck it!" he shouted. He would turn the stupid thing in when they called about it. First, he needed to go be with his sister. Over the next week, James did not concern himself with finding a new job or even give his boss a second thought. He spent the time making arrangements for his niece's funeral and being with his sister at the trial. Finally, the day came. The evidence was open and shut. The cops found the kid in the car, drunk off his ass with James's niece's blood on the car. However, he said he was not the driver, and the cops found him in the passenger seat, blacked out. There was no evidence of a second person in the vehicle. The jury went back and deliberated for less than 20 minutes. They came back with a verdict of not guilty. This sent James into a rage. He knew his former boss had done some illegal shit to pull this off. It was the last straw. James went home after he dropped his sister at her house and managed to get her to sleep. He considered getting drunk, yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized this bastard needed to learn that his actions have consequences. James got into his car later in the night, only to notice that it's 6 o'clock in the morning. No one would be in the office for another 2 hours except Travis. That man always got there promptly at 7 o'clock. It took James about an hour to get his former place of employment. He saw that Travis had indeed already gotten there upon his arrival. He took out his old access card. He'd hoped it had not been deactivated yet. James slid the card through the slot. The red dot quickly turned green, allowing him access. Thank God, he thought. It still works. He went to the elevator, pressed the button to the top floor of the massive structure, and waited for the doors to open. The elevator ride took maybe 5 minutes to complete, the gears grinding as the metal container moved up every floor before coming to an abrupt halt. The doors slid open and he quickly stepped out. He could hear his boss blasting his classical music, which he always played when he was hard at work on a difficult case. James grabbed the first heavy object that he could find before creeping into his boss's office. James, full of rage, smacked Travis in the back of the head as hard as he possibly could. Travis fell out of his chair, rolled over on the floor, and saw the face of his former secretary. As Travis's vision began to fade, darkness quickly overtook him. His eyes closed, which left a satisfying smirk to creep across James's lips. All that brings us to the current moment. James is still sitting here in the dark room, still strapped to that wooden chair. Where the fuck are you, James? Least you could do is show your face, you coward. Now, is that any way to speak to another person? An unfamiliar voice spoke. But I suppose that if you were a decent human being, then we would not find ourselves in this predicament. Now would we? Who's there? Travis yells. Oh, I would not expect you to know who I am. But I do believe that you and my brother have been introduced. The lights abruptly turned on to reveal James standing directly in front of him. Surprise! James shouts, a wicked grin plastered to his face. Travis makes a deep, hacking noise before saliva lands on James's face. Think you'll get away with this, you spineless guppy? Travis chuckles. From behind Travis comes the glitter of a knife. He received 2 quick, fairly deep cuts. The unfamiliar voice speaks once more, this time from directly behind him. Consider this the introduction to your current circumstance. If you insult me and or my brother again, then you shall receive cuts for everyone. If you lie to us, then you will also receive a cut. However, if you can humble yourself enough to tell us the truth, well, you may just walk out of this with your life. But I doubt you are even capable of that. Finally, stepping back from the shadows, the unfamiliar voice morphs into a person to reveal James's sister, Katie. Who the hell are you? I am the mother of the child who was murdered by the piece of shit you defended. That is who I am. Should give you another cut for that, but I'll give you a pass this time. I did forget to explain one thing to you, though. The more blood you lose, the more the container below you collects, and once you lose enough blood, it will trigger the pressure plate. And if that happens, well, you'll just have to see this for yourself. Katie points upward, knife still in hand, causing Travis to look up. He sees a net filled with a lot of large rocks. Sticks and stones will break your bones, and words will set you free. Let us begin with the first question. She excitedly claps. Did you, or did you not, spend the last 10 years treating my brother like your whipping boy? Travis opens his mouth to protest, yet he looks at James. I was not that bad of a boss, was I? He asks. James calmly looks at Travis before a guttural laugh leaves his throat. Not that bad! Not that bad! You never once gave me a holiday off, and you would dock my pay if I had to leave work early due to a family emergency. You were then as you are now. A monster, and quite frankly, an absolute nightmare to work for. Travis becomes angry at the sight of this man who is lesser than him, laughing and mocking him. Listen here, you little shit. You were a terrible employee, always whining about your family, your hours, not being able to have holidays off. If you had to put a little more effort into your job, then maybe, just maybe, I would have treated you better. Katie's amused expression rapidly fades as she glances at her brother. Do you want to do the honors, or should I? She inquires. James reaches out, his hand grabbing the knife from his sister with a sick smile on his lips. This one is all me, he says. James walks over to where his boss is being forced to sit. He roughly cuts the shirt from his boss's torso. What are you doing? Travis furrows his brows. The blade easily glides along Travis's chest 5 separate times, which causes him to tense up a bit. There's one thing I want you to know, just in case you think this is a joke. I assure you it is not. We're serious, and you should know that this is a fight for your life and not a silly game, James sneers. Okay, now on to question 2. Do you feel guilty for setting free the people who have ruined other lives by committing heinous crimes against them? Honestly, no, I don't. I have done what I've done to achieve this lifestyle. I've come acquainted with it, and I would do it all over again. Travis calmly looks at them. Katie looks at him with a curious expression on her face. So, you're admitting you have tampered with evidence, threatened witnesses, and asked your clients to perjure themselves? Oh, what the hell? It's just us, right? Yeah, I did it. I did it all, and I loved every second of it. You don't even understand the kind of adrenaline rush that I get from breaking the law while knowing full well I'll never be caught. Being the smartest person in the room has its benefits, after all. You feel no remorse, then? Not even a little guilt for all the lies you've ruined? Well, I must commend you for telling the truth. Your lack of empathy towards your fellow man cannot, no, it will not be overlooked, Katie coldly states. She grabs the knife from her brother's weak grip. Her lips pursed into a tight line as the anger building within her struggles to be contained. This one is all mine. She walks over to Travis, one eager step at a time. Her feet stop just before him. She calmly places the knife against his chest, firmly pressing the blade in until it pierces the flesh. The blade is slowly dragged down the entirety of his chest. Her cutting is slow and deep, which evokes a scream out of Travis, the likes of which they have not heard to this point. Final question. Did you once hesitate to take that scumbag on as a client after finding out he killed my daughter, the niece of your employee at the time? Or did you not even care about my brother and his family enough to do that? Did you only care about the money? Travis looks at her. He thinks long and hard about how he should respond to this question. He knows it was inevitable for this exact question to come up, and he knows that his answer determines whether he lives or dies. Look, I know I should have treated you that I've treated you and your family horribly. I deserve to be judged for my sins. But this is not how I should be punished. The court of law is how I should be punished. To answer your other questions, though, yes, I do regret having taken on the case of your daughter's killer. However, my boss and his boss told me I would either win that case or I would be fired. So as you may be able to see by now, I had no choice but to take the case. Katie stares at Travis, weighing his words carefully. I'm not sure you actually mean what you're saying, yet I do agree that you should be judged by a court of law for the crimes you have committed. So, we will let you go under 2 conditions. First, I don't expect you to not tell the cops about your unfortunate abduction. But my brother was only following my instructions. This was not his idea in any way, so I want his name to stay out of it. That part is mandatory. You don't get to choose. Fine. If you want to take the blame for this, then that's on you. I'll keep his name out of this. What's your second condition? Travis impatiently asks. That is the fun part in her eyes. A menacing smile crosses her lips. Well, in the essence of the season and the need to celebrate Halloween, there are 2 doors. The first door says trick. You can go through that door if you want, but there's no guarantee you'll get out alive. The door 2 says treat. If you hit the upload button on the laptop sitting over there that was recording our conversation, by the way, it has your confession on it, uploading it to the police. Then the other door will unlock for you to get out safely, which will cause you to pay for your crimes. Now make your choice and accept your fate. Katie bends down. The blade of her knife glides under each tie that holds his limbs to the wooden chair. She is serious about giving him a chance to pay for what he has done. Travis, on the other hand, can't help but laugh at her. This woman must be delusional to offer him such a thing like that. Do you honestly think for even a moment I would consider uploading the stuff I just told you? I'll spend the rest of my life in jail. Travis walks over to the door labeled trick. He pulls the door open and steps over the threshold, only to be hit in the stomach by a fast-moving and solid object. Travis is caught in the shoulder. and then in the head several times as he is falling. His body hits the floor. Blood pours out of his head as he lay there, limp and broken. His vision starts to blur as he hears Katie's sickening voice once more. Katie pressed the button, shutting off the pitching machine that had been hurling baseball-sized rocks at Travis. She then walks over to him and whispers into his ear, "Sticks and stones, but break your bones. But words would have set you free." She laughs satisfyingly. "What the hell, Katie? I thought we planned on setting him free," James shouts. He grabs his sister by her shoulders, shaking her to provoke a response. Katie quickly slaps her brother in the back of the head. "He set the killer of my daughter free. Do you really think he was going to live?" "You're crazy. I'm going to the cops because you lost your goddamn minds. This is not okay. You need help." A loud bang fills the room as her brother turns to leave the room. James feels a sharp pain in his chest. He slowly looks down to see a small bullet wound, blood seeping out of the hole and running down his shirt. Katie walks over to him, a manic expression clouding her face. "My sweet, sweet brother, I'm so sorry. But if you stand against me, you must die as well. Goodbye, my dearest brother." And that was the end of that story. I gotta say, it's very well written. Definitely like the whole Saw vibe there. Very fitting. I didn't know you had left at all, Mighty Might. I'm glad you're back. Alrighty, so next story. This story is from another new author named A Camera Obscura. Currently, only link available for this new story is, or author that is through Reddit. Again, information is listed below in the description. Oh, I agree there very much that that story very good. I think if I went through it again, I would try to alter the way I read it a little bit differently. Maybe having maybe I can try to get Philia to do the female voice. So hopefully Philia sometime soon can come by and we can set up a new a stream where we both do some reading together. I think that would be pretty nice. So anyway, moving on. This story again, as I said, was by A Camera Obscura. Link in the description to the author's Reddit page. The name of the story is Mom's Cooking. My mom was an incredible woman. She grew up very religious, but fell in love with our dad and had me at 16. Her family kicked her out, and when Dad left her after Beck, my little sister, was born, she was completely alone. She had to work 3 jobs to pay rent and take care of us. We moved around a lot. Didn't have any close friends, but she never let that defeat her. She had a heart so kind and gentle. She was always full of hope and optimism, and we'd never see a frown on her face, no matter how bad our financial situation was. She was amazingly strong all her life. She was the rock in our ocean of despair and self-pity. She would always make the best out of anything that happened. When our water got cut off one year, she made up a song about the squeaking sound the sink made and got us kids to play instruments by banging on rusty pots and pans. It made an absolute ruckus. The downstairs neighbors banged on the ceiling with a broom, and we collapsed laughing on the floor. Mom would never, ever get mad at us. Not even when we stole some of her savings to go buy cheap candy at the convenience store. We were often ungrateful little shits, but she never held that against us. She told us that she understood and that it was okay to be upset and jealous of other kids at school because they got a new TV and video games, and we got a matted teddy bear and watery markers from the toy drive. It wasn't easy growing up, but Mom made it all worth it. She saved up our whole childhood from every paycheck and encouraged us to make lots of efforts in school. So with the scholarships, she was able to send us to both fairly good college. I graduated 2 years ago and got a job in the field very soon. And with the earnings from my student job, I was able to get Mom a better apartment, close to the one I share with Beck, who's in her last year of school, and my cat Luna. It's a small but cozy, and Beck decorated it with lots of plants and trinkets she found at the thrift store. She's very good at that type of stuff. We all remained a close family, seeing each other every day. It was the best of times. That was until a few months ago. One morning, I got a call from work from a panicked, crying Beck urging me to come home. I got back a few minutes later to a team of paramedics carrying Mom out of her apartment on a stretcher, unconscious. Turns out Beck had gone to hang out with her on her day off and found Mom laying on the floor of her bathroom. She had suffered from a heart attack. My sister and I held her hands in the ambulance and waited, sobbing in each other's arms outside Mom's hospital room until a doctor came to tell us the news. Mom died that day. We were devastated. It was so unfair. She was so young and had been in perfect health her whole life. There was no history of heart disease in her family. The months following the accident passed and merged into each other in a blur. Beck and I couldn't concentrate on anything. We couldn't sleep and barely talked because any mention of Mom would make us go back to crying for hours until exhaustion. We didn't understand how this could happen. We grew numb. We were zombies, barely going through the day. We didn't see the point of the funeral, since it had only been 3 of us our whole lives. But Mom wrote in her will that she wanted a church ceremony and to be buried in the cemetery next to it. Beck was furious, the first emotion she had shown in weeks. She said religion was the reason Mom lived miserably, and if God really existed, he would have protected her and never been this cruel. When the day of the funeral came and Mom's parents showed up crying at the ceremony, I had to physically retain Beck from punching Grandpa in the face and tearing Grandma's fancy little black satin hat. We sat on an uncomfortable bench at the back of the church and watched them pray and sing and sync with the priest. At the burial, Grandma fell on her knees in front of the tomb, and I saw Beck's eyes burn with anger. The priest said a few words again, and we both put a lily, Mom's favorite flower, and a picture of us three at Christmas last year on the casket before it was hauled into the ground. That way, a part of us would always remain with her. The tears came again when it was time to say our final goodbye, our eyes leaking like an open faucet. We sat in silence in the car on the way back home, lost in our own thoughts. Someone so obviously missing from the back seat. I felt like a hole had been carved out of my soul. Out of the blue, my sister exclaimed, "Did you see how much makeup that old hag was wearing? It's caked on so much she could open a full bakery. And her acting skills, Oscar-worthy. I hope Mom comes back to haunt that bitch for the rest of her sad, selfish life." I sat there holding the steering wheel in complete shock till I heard my sister giggle. I looked at her and felt a smile forming until we both broke out into a fit of uncontrolled laughter. I had to pull over to the side of the road or I would have caused an accident. When we were finally able to stop, Beck managed to say, "I'm so sorry. For a while there, it just felt good to be angry instead of sad." "I know," I answered. "And I think Mom wouldn't want us to mope like this. She would want us to remember her and smile and dance to the music she loved and laugh at the jokes she used to make. In a way, I think she'll always live through us if we continue to remember her." After a moment, Beck added, I think she'll always watch over us. Not that I believe in paradise or anything, but I can feel that she's not completely gone." I smiled and nodded and started driving again. After that day, slowly but surely, life started coming back into us. Last weekend, we both felt ready to go through Mom's things. We entered her apartment for the first time since the accident. A thin layer of dust had formed, covering the furniture, and particles danced in the light filtering through the curtains. Taking a deep breath, Beck and I advanced in the hallway up to Mom's room where she kept most of her belongings. Beck sat down on the bed while I went to the closet. Her blue hair clashing with the burnt orange of the comforter. "It feels really weird to be in here without her, doesn't it?" she asked, a shiver going down her spine. "Yeah, it really does. It's like my brain can't process that we have to empty this place and never come back," I answered. I opened the closet door and started moving the hangers, not truly looking at anything. I wasn't making a lot of progress while Beck had gotten up and was going through Mom's desk, examining each piece of the few jewelry and makeup items held in the drawers, stopping when one of them made a memory resurface. She pulled out the necklace we had made for her birthday, out of flimsy beads that spelled out her name when we were kids. She kept it all these years. I saw a tear go down my sister's cheek and had to keep mine from flowing out again. I turned back to the closet and took out a few dresses, and including the flowery one Mom always wore on hot summer days when she went to the park with us and watched us swim in the overcrowded pool, until I noticed a little book sitting on the top shelf. One look at its red, worn cover, I recognized it. Mom's homemade cookbook. You have to understand, Mom was an amazing cook and baker. And even though we were poor, she always had a warm, earthy meal and a sweet dessert waiting for us every night. The secrets to her delicious recipes lied in that little journal that Mom carried through every single move. I'd say it was her most prized possession, and Beck and I were never allowed to read it. She said she would teach us when we were older and independent so that we could make those meals ourselves, but she died before being able to do so. My heart started beating faster as I couldn't help but let my childhood excitement crash back into me. I'd always wondered what kind of special magic skills that the book held. This was the moment of truth. I called Beck over, and when she noticed what I was holding, her eyes went wide. Is that her famous cookbook?" she asked, and walked towards me with visible apprehension. "Is this the time when we finally know how she made cheap food taste so amazing?" she continued. It was true. With the salary Mom had, Beck and I often wondered how her ingredients always seemed to be of such good quality, especially the meat tasting so rich and expensive. She'd never stolen anything, and we watched her bring home baskets from the food bank. So we figured she was just a really talented chef. Finally, I opened the cookbook to the first page, Beck looking over my shoulder. What we found were old-fashioned family recipes, a carbonara spaghetti sauce, a roast chicken with buttered mashed potatoes, beef stew with carrots, Thanksgiving turkey, a baked Christmas ham, chicken pot pie, layered cakes, strawberry muffins, bread pudding. Nothing remotely special about them. Beck and I looked at each other in confusion and a bit of deception, until I looked back at the page we were on and noticed a man's name written at the bottom. Jackson, it said. I turned more pages, and weirdly, every single one of them had a name written. Some names even repeating. Thomas, Joe, Morris, Harrison, Lewis, all men's names, one for each recipe. I felt Beck tense up as she too started to understand. See, what I haven't told you is Mom had a lot of boyfriends when we were growing up. She would come back home some nights, a new man following her into the room. However, they never acknowledged Beck and I. They only had eyes for Mom. They almost seemed hypnotized by her. She was very beautiful, of course, and young, but we didn't like those men coming into our little family and taking Mom's attention. She told us not to worry, though, that we would always be more important than anyone else, and just be polite and eat dinner with her and a new friend. We would then go back to our rooms, do homework, and go to sleep, and the man would be gone the next morning. We grew accustomed to this routine, and to thank us for being so nice with her boyfriends, Mom would cook us a special or even more copious meal the next day. So we forgot about the incidents and never asked questions. When we had to move to a new town, Mom would always wait some time before bringing home her boyfriends to the new apartment. And as the cookbook started shaking in my hand, memories of odd moments, like the fact that Mom would always come home late sometimes with dirt under her finger, unkempt hair, or a weird stain on her shirt, that the freezer was always full of meat, and she sometimes seemed panicked and told us to pack everything because we had to move out that day, started playing through my mind. Beck gripped my arm and the book dropped to the ground. Mom was an incredible woman who did everything in order to offer us a happy childhood. And even today, nothing will ever change that in my eyes. And that was the end of that one. So, I actually liked that story. I thought that was very well made, very well done. So I'm thrilled with that one, I think, honestly. What do you all think? Is anyone still listening? Well, either way, I think it's a really well-written story, I believe, in my opinion. I think it was done well. So, one moment here. I forgot to add one of my authors to the list details, so I'm doing that now. Okay. That would be Richard Saxon. I've read several of his stories already, so hopefully he doesn't get too upset that I forgot to add the information in. So I'm doing it now, and that way it'll update. Okay, so let's see that. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started on the next story here. This one is by HeadOfSpectre. I've read many of his stories as well. Again, as I have said several times now, all the stories that I read will have their the author's information in the description. Of course, I made a mistake that I've just updated, so it should show. Yes, it now shows. Okay. But yeah, I make sure everybody that the people I read, stories that I read, will have that information. So we're going to go ahead and get started on this next story, titled "A Monolith by the Sea" by HeadOfSpectre. Mist rose in a thick haze, obscuring my vision as we drove along the road by the sea, down to the monolith. As we approached, I saw why it had earned its name. I could see it further down the coast, a dark, solid shape jutting out from the side of the rocky cliffside. Time had eroded the concrete foundations, but had not destroyed the great fortress that stood vigilant on the coastline. What had once been called Cordington Citadel now sat abandoned in this forsaken part of the coastline. Years ago, back when World War II had been in full swing, Cordington, or the Monolith as its denizens called it, was quite a busy little outpost, monitoring friendly seas for German U-boats and launching British submarines. At the time, people had joked that a sailor could have seen its bulky concrete tower all the way from Denmark, and indeed it was quite inconspicuous. That was part of the point, though. Half the purpose of the monolith was to launch submarines, but the other half was to see sailors safely home. There was even a lighthouse on the cliffs above the installation that was part of the property, and as far as I could tell, it was still operational. After the war, though, there was no purpose for the old fort. Over the time, the monolith was decommissioned and ultimately abandoned. The government still owns the property, but there's really nothing they seem to be doing with it. Occasionally, it'll be rented out for a movie shoot. The abandoned base has featured in a few small-time films, mostly for interior locations, and it really does have quite an impressive little resume. The interior really is a beautiful sight to see, even if it is a tad run down, and that was part of why we were there, to try and document that interior before time took it all away from us. My name is James Davidson, and I want to be one of the greats, like Stanley Kubrick or Steven Spielberg. I love the atmosphere of some older movies, and I want to recreate that in my own films. That was what drew me to the monolith. From what I knew, it was the perfect setting for the latest film I had in mind. I didn't have much of a budget or any big-name actors, but I was sure I could work with what I did have as long as I used it all effectively. And I figured the monolith would be a big part of that. And that was why I was here that day. I just wanted to scout out the location and see if it would actually suit my needs. In the car beside me was Darren Lay, a close friend of mine who I'd worked with before and was more than happy to work with again. And Darren was a decent cameraman, and he knew how to handle the equipment well enough. Besides, it was nice at least to have someone to talk to on my lonely excursion. "Hell of a morning," I remember him saying. He was looking out over the North Sea to our left as we drove. The mist didn't let him see far, but yet there was something beautiful and ethereal about its presence. "We should get some shots of that. It's a damn pretty sight if there's ever been one." I glanced over at the mist. Darren was right. It was a pretty sight to see. It would have been a crime not to immortalize it. The mist ahead of us swirled around the gray rectangular building ahead of us. Despite the stories of the height of the monolith, I found it was far wider than it was tall. It looked almost like an old castle sitting on the edge of the sea, and the approach was like something out of a dream. As we got closer, I could see the chain link fence that stopped us from getting closer, and my car slowed to a stop. Technically, he had no right to actually be there. The gate was closed, but that really didn't bother me much. I knew I wouldn't be the first person to have snuck into the monolith, and I wasn't going to be the last either. I pulled off onto the side of the road to park and get out of the car, and Darren did the same. We headed around to the trunk to get his equipment, mostly just a few cameras for some test shots. We would discuss getting a legitimate permit to film in the monolith when we actually went there to film. This was just to ensure we weren't wasting our time with the place. "You got the wire cutters?" I asked. I lit a cigarette as I looked out over the sea. I already had a good vibe about this place. It gave the exact atmosphere that I wanted for my movie. I was still finishing the script, but it was meant to be a grim wartime character study about a technician on a base during World War II. And if I got it right, it would be a masterpiece, on par with great films like Joker and Citizen Kane. Perhaps it might even bring me to the level of fame I'd only ever dreamed of before. "I got him there," Darren said, and brushed past me. He cut the fence near where it met the cliff. Nothing would be immediately noticeable, just enough to let us push through to get inside. The monolith stood before us, unguarded and free to explore. I could only contain my excitement as I started towards the old building. An abandoned road, overgrown with a few resilient weeds, led towards the entrance of the base. The windows were boarded up with plywood, and the concrete exterior was cracked and worn. We found a way inside and were greeted with an old, musty smell. The base was, it was in worse shape than I had anticipated. There had been little to no upkeep of it in the last 70 to 80 years, and it showed. I could hear the steady dripping of water somewhere far off in the distance, and there was no light other than the light from mine and Darren's phones. "This is it?" he asked, and he sounded disheartened. I won't lie, I was pretty upset too. This place seems so dead. I'll confess, I imagined something far more grand and photogenic, but instead this building felt like a waterlogged carcass. But we had come all this way, and to give up on first sight would be a mistake. "We'll see about what the rest of the base looks like," I said. "Let's go." With that, I descended into the darkness, unaware of what was waiting. Much of the layout of the monument was devoted to the submarine bays. There were 12 of them in total, spanning the entire length of the base. Near the rear, built into the cliff wall, was what I assumed to have once been barracks and offices, although it was hard to tell. Any furniture had long since been cleared away, leaving nothing behind but cracked concrete. I saw a few small areas that might do for filming if they were dressed up a bit, but they would probably have required far more time, effort, and budget than I had to spare. Darren took his photographs, but it was already a foregone conclusion that the interior of the monolith had little to offer. We'd wasted our time, even if neither of us wanted to admit it yet. That's not to say that the monolith is not interesting. Far from it. The old base had an allure to it that was hard to accurately describe. It was rather fascinating to explore a place that was almost forgotten to time. "Hey, James, take a look at this." I was standing in one of the sub-bays when Darren called out to me. "Looks like they left something behind." I went over, wondering just what it was he had seen. He'd wandered off an inside side room, and I was a little surprised to see a spiraling stairwell in an alcove against the wall. The metal was old and rusted. Climbing it may have been a mistake, but it led me upwards to some unseen part of the space, and Darren was already halfway up. You sure that's safe?" I asked. But he didn't reply. He just vanished up the stairs. "Darren!" I called. Still no reply, but I could hear his footsteps. I sucked in a deep breath and swore quietly before I started up the rusty staircase. The ancient metal groaned under my weight as I followed Darren up. The rusted stairway led up quite a ways, but I could hear Darren just above me. I could feel the powdered rust shaking off the old stairs above me and into my hair before I reached the top. "Look at this!" I heard him say. From what I could see, he was standing in a circular room that was more brightly lit than the rest of the base. I looked up and I could see a seemingly endless tower with a spiral staircase curling around the walls like a tentacle. It took me a moment to realize I was inside a lighthouse. No, the lighthouse. It must have gone deep into the earth so it could be accessed easily through the monolith. "Does it go all the way up?" I asked. "Only one way to find out," Darren said as he began to ascend the stairs. This time, I didn't wait behind him. The stairs here were newer. They didn't creak and groan beneath our weight as much. Clearly, the government had ensured that this lighthouse was operational. I suppose that made sense. It couldn't hurt to have one more beacon out at sea. Darren and I climbed the lighthouse tower in silence. It was one hell of a climb, but Darren wanted to investigate, and I was admittedly curious as to what it was like at the top myself. At the top of the lighthouse, we could see most of the monolith far below us through the mist. The sea stretched out into the infinite void of white mist, and we were denied a view of its true majesty, but there was something breathtaking about the sights we did see. Darren's camera clicked as he snapped a photograph. "This is gorgeous," he said under his breath. We could get some outstanding shots from up here." I just nodded silently in response. The shining beacon spun slowly behind us, sending its light far away. My eyes studied the sea before I looked down to the monolith below us. Then, just outside the installation, I saw small shapes moving amongst the mist, and I squinted to try to get a better look at them. "Darren, I don't think we're alone." Darren paused and looked down. It took him a minute to see what I saw. "Shit, do you think someone saw us come in?" "It's possible," I replied. We should go. We'll get back to the car and get the hell out of here." Darren frowned. He didn't like the idea, but he couldn't disagree. Hiding in the lighthouse tower would have effectively cornered at us, and neither of us wanted that. I started back down the stairs again, taking them almost two at a time, and I could hear Darren behind me. We reached the landing where the lighthouse began. There was a closed door that I assumed led outside, and I almost considered taking it. To do so would have meant we'd find ourselves at the top of the cliff with no clear way down. We needed to go the way we'd come in, through the rusted staircase. I saw it through a doorway that Darren had forced open when he'd come in first. It was rusted to shit, so he'd probably broken it easily. With my friend behind me, I started for those rusted stairs, and I didn't linger on them. I hurried down, not thinking about whether the stairs could handle my speed. I could hear Darren coming down behind me, and the metal groaned in protest. I shouldn't have been surprised when it gave out, but I still was. As we were nearing the final few steps, Darren gave a sudden cry before a section of the spiral stairs snapped beneath him. I didn't see him fall, but I saw him hit the ground, and I heard his cry of pain. "Fucking hell!" "Darren?" As I reached the ground again, I saw what had hurt him. A section of the broken metal had left a jagged tear in his calf. Blood soaked through his jeans, and Darren clutched his leg, gritting his teeth to stop himself from screaming. The sight of all that blood turned my stomach, and as the panic set in, it was harder to think clearly. We needed to go. "Shit, Darren, can you stand?" He just growled at me, and I took its meaning that he couldn't exactly get up on his own. I rushed over to him, offering him a hand to pull him to his feet. "Come on, man, come on!" Darren did what he could to pick himself up, and he cried out in pain as he did. He almost collapsed outright before he steadied himself. His wounded leg wobbled under his weight as he leaned against the wall for support. "Fuck! Jesus! fucking Christ, James! Hold still. Let me see how bad it is. I leaned down, looking at the bleeding gash in Darren's leg. I wasn't a doctor. I had no idea how to diagnose any of this, but it looked bad. We need to get you to a doctor, I finally said. No shit, James. Last thing I needed was his attitude at the moment, but I tried to ignore it. Let's get you back to the car. The car? You want me to walk back to the car? Darren asked. He laughed loudly and humorously. You want to get arrested? I'm fucking bleeding, you daft cunt! We're not sneaking past anyone who's in here. Be a man. Bite the bloody bullet. Call for help. Deeper in the base, I heard movement and spun around. With all the noise we were making, of course, we'd already been found. I glanced at Darren before deciding that wasn't much of a choice. He was right. Sneaking to the car wasn't an option. Over here! I called. My friend's hurt bad. Bring help! Movement in the darkened halls grew closer, and I saw a man enter the room. Thank God! Do you have a phone? Should we call an ambulance? I asked. The man didn't reply. He stood in the doorway, staring at us before he began to approach. As he drew nearer, though, something seemed off. His gait was slow and sluggish. He walked like a drunkard, dragging his feet and staggering towards us. I could hear water dripping onto the concrete as if this newcomer had just crawled out of the sea. As he got closer, I could make out some of the details of his uniform. It was dark blue with a white belt. His clothes were soaking wet and dripping onto the floor. I could see a white undershirt clinging to his chest as he drew near. His skin seemed so pale, it almost seemed to glow in the dim light. His eyes looked sunken in and hollow. Staring at him filled me with a quiet, creeping dread, and I found myself recoiling from him. Sir? I asked. Still no response. Behind him, I could see two similarly dressed men entering the room behind him. Like him, they moved with a shuffling gait. Water dripped from their drenched uniforms. James! Darren asked. What the fuck is wrong with them? I had no answer. I didn't know what I was looking at. But I knew it scared the piss out of me. I recognized those uniforms from my research on my screenplay. They were naval. Not just naval. They were old. These looked like World War II era uniforms, not what you'd see on a few security guards, or, God forbid, the police. James, Darren asked again. They were so close now. Getting closer with every passing second, and I finally found my voice again. Run! I grabbed Darren by the wrist, not caring if he could actually run or not. Wait! He called. The camera! He tried to pull away from me and reach for the camera. With everything that happened, I hadn't noticed he'd dropped it when he'd fallen through the stairs. I hadn't even thought about the bloody camera. Leave it! I called, but Darren pulled away from me, almost collapsing to snatch the camera off the ground. I felt a cold, wet hand grabbing my arm in an iron grip. One of the dead-eyed soldiers pulled me towards the door and yanked me off my feet. I watched as his companions grabbed Darren and began to drag him along the concrete floor, leaving a bloody trail in his wake as he struggled and thrashed in their grip. Let me go! You goddamn bastards! Let me the fuck go! I tried to brace my feet against the concrete and pull myself free, but the sailor who had a grip on me would not relent. Without a word from our captors, Darren and I were dragged through the abandoned monolith and out through the way we'd come in. Around us, I saw other dead-eyed figures. Most were sailors. Some were dressed in other outfits. I spotted a couple figures in more modern attire. All of them were pale and dripping wet. All of them looked dead. What the fuck? What the fuck? I heard Darren yell. His voice quaked with fear. He didn't know what was going on any more than I did, and truth be told, I didn't want to fucking know. As we were dragged out of the monolith, I saw even more dead men around us. They stood around, mindless guardians of this place, and they stared upwards towards the top of the cliff. My eyes shifted upwards, looking at the lighthouse we had just been inside. The light from its beacon cut through the mist and stretched far out over the sea. And as I looked up at it, I realized that even abandoning the monolith still served its purpose. At one point, half of that purpose had been to launch submarines, but the other half was to see sailors safely home. Looking around at the dead men around me, I realized these were those sailors who had been claimed by the sea. Home at last. "Let go! Let go!" Darren screamed, and his cries brought me back to reality. I looked ahead of us to where the dead sailors were trying to drag us. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks, and a spike of panic rose in my chest. They were bringing us to the sea, and if they did not let go, they'd drag us to the watery depths they'd come from, and then we, like them, would be of the sea. Dead things bound to return to this place by whatever natural thing had risen them from their graves. No, I didn't want to die, not like this. With all my strength, I struggled and fought. I brought my leg around to kick at the sailor who was dragging me, but he barely seemed to flinch, and his iron grip didn't let up. No! My frantic screams didn't register with me at first, but when they did, they actually unnerved me. My eyes were wide open as I struggled against the grip of the sailor dragging me to my death. I wished we'd never heard of the monolith. I wished we'd never come to that wretched place. We were so close to the rocks now. I braced my feet against them, trying to hold some sort of ground and stop myself from being dragged into oblivion. The sailor dragging me paused only for a moment, and I saw an opening. I kicked at his knee. Suddenly, I felt it snap and bend in half. He didn't make a sound. His grip didn't even let up, but he did fall. I moved to stand over him and twisted his arm back behind him until I heard a bone snap. His grip on me loosened, and I felt a sudden spike of joy. I was free. James! I looked over at Darren, and as I did, I saw the other dead-eye sailors looking at me. I saw their bodies moving towards me. If I ran for Darren, they would have gotten me. There's no way to free him and fight off more of those cold, undead things. No, I couldn't do that. I took a step back, clearing the way for the dead sailors to drag Darren to the edge of the sea as he screamed my name. James! Help me! I couldn't, though. I tried. If I tried, we'd both ended up dead. Even if I succeeded, the wound on his leg was too serious. He'd have no way to run. Even if I made it to my car, he'd have bled out before we got him to safety. No, Darren was dead the moment he'd fallen. My camera was clutched in his hand, and I almost went in to grab it. Almost. What few photographs we'd taken was not worth my life, though. I would not be returning to the monolith. That much was for sure, and I left it behind along with Darren as I turned to run. James! I heard him scream after me, but I didn't look back. James! James, help me! Jesus Christ, James! James! I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, sprinting past the sluggish dead things and towards the hole we cut in the fence. I didn't stop until I was inside my car. Speeding off down the road we come. In my rearview mirror, I saw the shapes of what once were men, trying to pursue me, but I was free of them. Soon, they vanished into the mist, along with Darren's final cries. I will not return to the monolith. I have seen all I needed to see of that place, and I know no good can come from being there. I know that among the dead things that may arise from the sea as the mist overtakes the old fortress, there is a figure with the face of a friend. Perhaps Darren is dead and gone for good. Perhaps his corpse doesn't rise with the others. But I am happy never knowing for sure. Too many nights I've woken up in a cold sweat from a dream of Darren wrapping his cold, dead hands around my throat and dragging me from my bed. And some nights, I swear, I hear the steady drip of water to my bedroom floor. And that was the end of that story. I hope you enjoyed it. And yes, Alex, this is all live. I do my streams live. I do not pre-record. Not yet, at least. I haven't gotten to that point. But glad to see you here, Alex. Good to see you. Is anybody else still around? Because it kind of seems like everyone's asleep or gone. I don't know. Anyway, I do have a couple more stories I could read, but it is almost 2.5 hours since we started this stream. If there are more of you guys who would like to hear me read some more, let me know. Otherwise, I think I might call it a night. So, anybody up for more stories, or what do you guys want to do? Well, looks like everyone has headed out. So, I'm going to go ahead and call it a night then, it seems. You guys have a wonderful evening. If, in case you have missed any part of this stream or showed up late, I do leave the streams up on my channel. You can also direct family and friends to listen to them in case they're unable to make our visiting hours. We have finally reached the end of our time together this evening. Visiting hours are now over, and while I hope to see you all here again, perhaps I can convince you to be permanent residents at the asylum. I am Beyond 5150, and I wish you all wonderful nightmares. Good night, sleep well, and just ignore the screams.
you.